Almost everyone has heard of Auschwitz, the infamous concentration camp that became a factory of death, complete with gas chambers and crematoria. But what follows goes beyond the systematic mass killings. Auschwitz was not solely defined by the sheer number of victims. It was a place of extreme suffering and despair, where cruelty was institutionalized, and those who inflicted it took perverse pleasure in their actions. It functioned as a laboratory of pain, managed by uniformed sadists and by prisoners forced into brutality. Dehumanization, cruel games, medical experiments, confinement in standing cells, and dogs attacking chained men were not rare events. They were part of daily life. And just when one thinks the horrors could not escalate further, there existed a torture device so barbaric that even SS officers acted as if it were imaginary. You are unprepared for what comes next. Auschwitz, the notorious death camp of Nazi-occupied Europe, was established in 1940, shortly after Germany conquered Poland. The Nazis selected the site of a former Polish military barracks in the town of Auschwitz, renaming it Auschwitz. Initially, the camp was meant to detain Polish political prisoners. Rudolf Höss, a prominent Nazi official, was appointed its first commandant, tasked with transforming the site into a functional prison. By the spring of 1941, roughly 11,000 prisoners, mostly Polish, were held there. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the prisoner population surged. By the end of that year, Soviet POWs were sent to the camp, bringing the total to about 18,000. This original section became known as Auschwitz III, recognizable by the large iron gate inscribed with the phrase Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. Yet Auschwitz soon became far more than a labor camp. Prisoners were starved, tortured, and worked to death. Although not yet officially a death camp, it foreshadowed the horrors to come. On September 3, 1941, the Nazis carried out the first mass killings with Zyklon B gas in the basement of the infamous Block 11 in Auschwitz-Chater. Previously used to exterminate lice, the Nazis were testing its effectiveness on humans. Around 600 Soviet POWs and 250 sick Polish inmates were murdered during this operation, marking the first use of gas chambers for mass extermination at Auschwitz. As the prisoner population swelled, construction began in October 1941 on Auschwitz II, also known as Birkenau. Built about 2 miles from the original camp on the site of a former Polish village, the Germans evicted residents and demolished most buildings. Besides Auschwitz I and II, the complex also included Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, a labor camp supplying workers to nearby factories. Though not intended as a death camp, conditions were so brutal that many prisoners did not survive. In contrast, Auschwitz II was designed to hold far larger numbers as part of the Nazi Endlösung der Judenfrage, or final solution, the plan to systematically exterminate Europe's Jewish population. Formalized at the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, this genocidal policy relied on mass shootings and gas chambers at extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau. Immediately following the Wannsee Conference, Auschwitz II began receiving transports of Jews from across occupied Europe. Many prisoners were killed upon arrival, with selections conducted directly on the train platforms. The elderly, children, and sick were sent straight to the gas chambers. Initially, these chambers were housed in old farmhouses, the so-called Little Red House, Bunker 1, and Little White House, Bunker 2. Without crematoria at the time, corpses were burned in open pits, making the process painfully slow. To streamline mass murder, the Nazis constructed 4 crematoria buildings in 1943, combining gas chambers with ovens. The design made the extermination process much faster, as these facilities could kill up to 4,400 people a day. As a further improvement of the death facto's effectiveness, a railway line was extended into the middle of Birkenau to handle large numbers of incoming transports. It is estimated that over 1.1 million people were killed in Auschwitz. Most of them were Jews, but among victims were also Poles, Roma, Soviet PWs, and others labeled enemies of the Nazi regime. The mass extermination lasted until the last days. In late 1944, as Soviet forces were approaching Auschwitz, the Nazis began erasing traces of their crime. Heinrich Himmler ordered the destruction of all the gas chambers and crematoria, except for crematorium 5, which was used until the very end. When Red Army troops liberated Auschwitz, there were around 8,000 prisoners that the Nazis didn't manage to eliminate. The rest were either killed or moved to other camps. Theses survivors lived to tell the world of one of the greatest horrors in the history of humankind: the unspeakable testimonies of torture suffered by Auschwitz victims. Dehumanization. Torture in Auschwitz took many forms and surpassed even the darkest limits of imagination. It affected every prisoner without exception. Its purpose was not only to punish or cause pain, but to erase every notion that the victims were human beings. This lesson was taught the moment prisoners arrived at the camp. It was the first torture they endured and one that continued throughout their entire imprisonment. Dehumanization. Arriving at the camp. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, prisoners were pulled from the train cars by force. Many of them had traveled for days without food or water. Some were sick. Others were already too weak to walk. Nevertheless, there was no time to rest. SS guards shouted at prisoners and hit their backs with rifle butts to keep them moving. Prisoners were literally shoved through the camp gates. Loud barking dogs only added to the overall sense of confusion and desperation. Prisoners were ordered to form lines. Men in one, women and children in another. Prisoners deemed fit for forced labor were sent to the right, while those considered unfit, such as the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, mothers with young children, and most children, were sent to the left. None of them knew that the left meant death. They believed they were going to the showers. After the selection process, prisoners had their hair shaved off. This would be used later for various manufacturing processes. They were stripped of their clothing and all personal belongings were taken. Watches, shoes, family photos, everything was lost. Then they were told to go to the showers. And while the prisoners from the right column did have a shower, those from the left were sent to rooms that only resembled showers. They had tiled walls and shower heads, but instead of water, the shower heads were releasing poisonous gas. Exposure to the gas caused death within minutes. Prisoners first experienced dizziness, nausea, rapid heartbeat, convulsions or loss of consciousness, followed by respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. Unfortunately, those who were not sent to gas chambers had little reason to consider themselves the lucky ones. Their misery was yet to begin. After the showers, they received striped uniforms. There were no proper shoes or socks. Many were barefoot. Each person was assigned a number, the first step of dehumanization. While some had their number written on a card, the majority had a number tattooed on their arm. From this point on, their names were no longer used. They were not humans, but numbers. After the admission procedure, prisoners were forced to stand in formation for hours. They were not allowed to make the slightest move. Anyone who fell was beaten, even if he collapsed from exhaustion. Then they were sent to the barracks, overcrowded and cold facilities, more suitable for animals than for humans. Barracks were equipped with triple-tiered wooden bunks with each level shared by several prisoners. Food was not given right away. Some waited a full day before eating, and when it finally came, it was nothing more than a small piece of bread or watery soup. The arrival process was fast and harsh. It made one immediately give up on the hopes of leaving this place alive. Forced exercises. The camp guards made sure the maltreatment was maintained on a daily basis. Prisoners were not to be allowed a single moment of dignity. Each morning, prisoners were dragged from their barracks and marched onto the main square. There they were forced into brutal sessions of exercises. The square would become a training ground of torment. Prisoners, many sick, weak, or elderly, were forced to perform meaningless and humiliating physical drills. They would squat and hop until their legs gave out. They waddled like ducks or rolled across the rough ground. Weak and malnutrition, prisoners would often drop from exhaustion. This was a call sign for guards to intervene. They would beat up prisoners who faltered with whips, rifle butts, or whatever they had at disposal. Many of the prisoners would never rise again. Jewish prisoners were given even more brutal tasks. They were pushed further and beaten harder if they failed to accomplish the task, and they never did. These exercises became routine. They continued day after day without pause, 6 days a week. By the seventh day, most of the older prisoners were dead. The younger ones could barely stand with their legs swollen and muscles torn. Yet, as soon as a new week began, the orders returned. Squat, hop, run. Those who had survived the drills were not made stronger. Exercises were not designed to make the prisoners fit, but to break them. This was not discipline. It was calculated destruction of the human body and will. Prolonged standing. Human body and will. Prolonged standing. The Auschwitz guards were so creative in tormenting prisoners that they even made standing still a form of torture. During morning roll calls, prisoners were forced to stand motionless for hours. Guards would line them up in rows, shoulder to shoulder, and ordered everyone not to move. It didn't matter if the sun burned their skin or if rain soaked through their clothes. It did not matter if they were sick, starving, or in pain. No one was allowed to sit, lean, or speak. If someone fainted, they were dragged back into line. If someone fell, they were beaten. Kazimir Albin, one of the Auschwitz survivors, remembered one of these punishments. One day, a prisoner escaped. During the evening roll call, the camp commandant warned the others, if no one came forward with information, all would be punished. Noon spoke. The commandant then gave a signal to the guards. These vicious SS men moved through the ranks, punching and kicking the silent prisoners. Still, the prisoners were not allowed to move. Otherwise, they would be beaten even more. Time passed slowly. Prisoners had to remain in place all night with no food or water. Their legs began to shake, muscles cramped. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others lost consciousness standing up. Those who wet themselves were mocked. These poor people had no choice. They were not allowed to step out of line, even to relieve themselves. One prisoner who could not hold any longer urinated where he stood. Guards screamed at him and then beat him with rifle butts and fists. The next day, the prisoners were still standing. They had been on the square since the previous evening. Finally, at 2:00 in the afternoon, 11 men were taken away for questioning. The rest were dismissed. Some had to be carried back to their blocks. Their feet were swollen. Many had their clothes soaked in sweat and waste, and it happened more than once. Every roll call brought the same fear. Prisoners never knew how long they would stand. Sometimes it was 2 hours, sometimes more. Even in the worst weather, the prisoners were forced to stand in snow, in wind, in heat. No one was excused. Those who trembled were told to stop shaking. Those who stumbled were beaten. The worst roll calls happened after acts of sabotage or resistance. On those days, the guards kept everyone standing through the night. By morning, bodies lay on the ground, stiff and frozen. There were occasions when prisoners were forced out to stand and watch the admission of new arrivals. When executions were carried out, prisoners were forced to stand and watch. Although they didn't suffer torment directly, watching other people die was a torture of its kind. It left prisoners wondering when their time would come. There was no dignity, no rest. The torment was constant. The worst thing was that prisoners were not allowed to respond to it. They had to stare straight ahead, trying not to blink, let alone cry. Cold water torture. There were literally no limits to the torture methods used on helpless prisoners who could do absolutely nothing to ease their suffering. One such method was the torture with cold water. It was late November 1941, when a group of Soviet prisoners of war were gathered to take a wash. They came to Auschwitz 2 months earlier and had not washed since their arrival. Their bodies were filthy, skin caked with dirt. Most wore nothing but torn rags. Soviet soldiers were herded into a large shower room. The building was so cold, and most prisoners hesitated to undress when the guards told them to do so. The guards began to yell, but the Soviets were still reluctant to take off their clothes. Then, without a warning, the guards opened the valves. A high-pressure jet of cold water hit the men. The guards aimed streams at their faces directly into their eyes, mouths, and ears. At freezing temperatures, icy water produced a burning sensation. Soviet prisoners tried to shield themselves, but there was no escape. Some tried to crawl under benches while others hid behind the bodies of soldiers who fainted from the shock. When the guards turned off the showers, the floor was covered in bodies. Weak and now frozen, Soviet PWS lay motionless. Their skin went pale and their lips turned blue. There were no towels to dry themselves, no dry clothes to change into. Those who could still move had to put on wet rags and return to their barracks. Others were dragged back, unable to walk. No one protested. No one asked questions. The survivors kept their heads down. They knew what came next if they refused again. That night, the barracks were quiet. The men lay shivering in wet clothes. There were no blankets to warm themselves. The next day, many of these poor soldiers were dead. The camp made no record of it. Their names disappeared. In Auschwitz, the guards turned water, a source of life, into a tool of torture, forced feeding. Similar was with the food, which was also used as a method of torture. Usually the daily meals in Auschwitz were meager, spoiled, or filled with non-edible waste. But sometimes guards tried to make it so unbearable that it hurt prisoners. One inmate who testified about crimes against prisoners described how he was brought a large plate of herring salad one day. The thing was, the salad was so heavily salted that it burned the mouth and throat. Since he was heavily malnourished and dehydrated, the salt made him choke, and after only a couple of bites, his stomach turned. He threw up everything he ate. However, seeing a man in torment was not enough for the guards, so they ordered him to lick his own vomit off the plate and eat it again. The prisoner tried to resist, but a blow from a soldier made him change his mind. He swallowed everything, fish, salt, vomit, and blood that he coughed out. Like other torture methods, this was not a one-time act. Other prisoners were also forced to do the same. Whenever someone vomited from bad food, they were made to eat it. If they refused, they were beaten or sent to worse punishments. The guards laughed as prisoners cried and tried to swallow. It was not just about feeding. It was about shame. Sometimes the entire serving of food for the prisoners was intentionally spoiled. Rotten cabbage, moldy bread, soup with garbage in it. When prisoners showed disgust or pushed it away, the guards reacted with rage. They kicked them, forced their mouths open, and shoved food in. One inmate said he was held down by 2 SS guards, while a third spooned rancid food into his mouth. When he vomited, they slapped him and did it again. Salt was the most usual method of food torture. Inmates were given bowls of oversalted soup, after which they were denied water to quench their thirst. This caused their lips to crack and tongues to swell. Still, all food had to be eaten. This kind of torture left no visible scars, but it broke the prisoners' spirits. It made them lose control of their bodies. They were turned into objects of ridicule. Their dignity was stripped away. They were completely dehumanized. But denying basic human dignity was only one part of the torture. The camp authorities didn't just want prisoners to feel unworthy of life. They wanted them to live in constant fear. Fear of being hurt. Fear of being killed. Every single day carried the risk of being pulled from the crowd and taken away. The slightest mistake could cost a life. Perhaps this kind of torture, although not so painful, left the biggest scars on prisoners. Instilling fear, guards used various methods to terrify the prisoners. The most common were public hangings, which everyone was forced to watch. Inmates were made to stand in rows as the gallows were prepared. A loudspeaker announced the crime and the sentence. There was no exception to who could be executed. Not even children were spared. Victims were dragged to the gallows with ropes placed around their necks. Prisoners were forced to watch the entire procedure. They had to witness their family and friends fall through the trapdoor and listen to the sound of their dying breaths. One time the guards organized a special celebration of the honker for Jewish inmates. On this holiday, also known as the Festival of Lights, it was customary for Jews to light a menorah, a 9-branched candelabrum. But instead of candles, the guards used the bodies of 9 dead men, hanging them on poles. The prisoners were then forced to pour oil over the corpses and set them ablaze. As the bodies burned through the night, they were compelled to sing Christmas carols instead of Jewish prayers. Physical torment was relentless, and it was only a matter of time before someone became a direct victim of brutal torture. While constant dehumanization inflicted lasting psychological damage, it was the physical abuse that left visible scars. Marks survivors would carry for the rest of their lives, if they survived at all. One of the most common forms of torment involved being suspended by the arms. Prisoners' hands were tied behind their backs, and their bodies were lifted off the ground, leaving their entire weight hanging from the shoulders. With arms twisted backward, joints would pop, elbows often dislocated, and shoulders sometimes torn completely. The agony was unbearable, with victims screaming until they lost consciousness, yet guards would leave them suspended for hours, sometimes repeating the ordeal the next day. Many survivors were left permanently crippled, unable to use their arms again. Shockingly, such punishments were often meted out for trivial offenses: stealing a turnip, speaking back, or moving too slowly during roll call. This method was frequently employed because, unlike other punishments, it caused no visible bloodshed while leaving deep, lasting damage. It reinforced the harsh lesson that silence, obedience, and invisibility were the only possible means of survival, though even that was sometimes insufficient. Even worse was a form of punishment known as 25 blows, one of the most dreaded torments in Auschwitz. Prisoners feared it above all else. Like suspension by the arms, it was used for minor mistakes and meted out without warning. A guard would simply order, "Take him for 25 blows." The prisoner was brought to the center of the block or work area, where a bench or wooden horse was prepared. He had to remove his pants, place his legs in the stocks, and bend over while 2 guards restrained his hands, ready to deliver the punishment. Then the beating began. Guards usually used a thick rubber truncheon or a wooden stick, striking the prisoner's buttocks, back, or thighs with full force. The prisoner was forced to count each blow out loud: 1, 2, 3. If he cried out in pain or lost count, the beating started over. If he passed out, the guards would revive him with water or slaps and resume the torture. One can hardly describe the intensity of pain. The beating would make the skin split open and tear the prisoner's muscles. It was not unusual for prisoners to lose control of their bowels during the punishment, only to the amusement of the guards. Very often, prisoners couldn't walk afterward and had to be carried back by fellow inmates. One inmate said he could not sit for weeks after the beating, while another claimed blows made him forget where he was. Naturally, there were no medical checks after the beating, not even a rest. The prisoner was sent back to work the same day. If he collapsed, he was beaten again. Almost always these beatings were public. All prisoners were forced to watch. The guards claimed it was to teach discipline. In reality, it was to spread terror. The sound of the stick hitting flesh and the prisoner's screams as he counted the blows echoed across the entire block. Women, too, were punished this way. One female inmate said the pain of the 25 blows she received stayed with her for years. Sadistic games. The variety of torture methods in Auschwitz was proof that the guards actually enjoyed tormenting the prisoners. For many years after the war, psychologists and historians sought to understand how ordinary individuals such as death camp guards became perpetrators of extreme cruelty. Many concluded that it was a mix of blind obedience, dehumanization, peer pressure, and ideological indoctrination that enabled guards to commit acts of sadism without remorse. In Auschwitz, SS guards went so far in their sadism that they invented barbaric games aiming to humiliate, torture, and kill prisoners. One of the most common was the cap game. A guard would walk past a prisoner and knock off his cap. Then he would pick it up and throw it beyond the marked line into the so-called forbidden zone. This was a strip of land near the camp fence marked by signs and wires. Everyone knew the rule. Crossing the line meant death. The guard would then order the prisoner to fetch the cap. The prisoner hesitated, knowing that stepping into the forbidden zone could be fatal. But disobeying the guard also meant punishment that could be worse than death. If the prisoner finally stepped forward to pick up the cap, the guard would call an alarm. He would raise his rifle and kill the prisoner with a single shot. The report would note that a prisoner was shot while attempting to escape. His body would be left on the ground as a warning. Such a sadistic game was a routine. The guards treated it like ass sport and enjoyed it. Sometimes a guard would toss several caps into the zone and call more than one prisoner. The men looked at each other, unsure who should move first. One always stepped forward. One always died. Torture by dogs. One thing that prisoners feared more than guards' guns was their dogs. These large, powerful animals, usually German shepherds, were trained to attack without hesitation. A single word or a signal from the guard was enough. The guards needed no special reason to set the dogs on inmates. One common practice was chaining 2 or more prisoners together. Then the guards released the dogs. The animals jumped at the prisoners, bit into their arms, legs, and faces. The chained prisoners could not escape. They tried to twist away, but the chain held them tight. The guards stood nearby and watched. They laughed as the dogs tore into flesh. Prisoners screamed, fell, or tried to cover each other. One survivor recalled how the guards used this torture to punish entire groups. If one man in the group made a mistake, all were chained and lined up. A couple of guards would gather and release their dogs upon them. They competed to see whose dog caused more damage. In the end, prisoners were left with deep wounds that could never heal properly in camp conditions. Many died from blood loss or infection only a day after. Those who were lucky to survive this torture carried bite marks for life. The trauma stayed with them. The barking of dogs filled them with fear even years after liberation. One survivor said he could hear the barking in his dreams decades after the war was gone. This was how the monsters from Auschwitz turned dogs, man's best friend, into instruments of torture. And it was all part of the system. Strangulation, drowning, suffocation. Among these monsters, some stood out for their exceptional cruelty. Before the war, Oswald Kaduk was a butcher from Königshuta, Upper Silesia. Working in a municipal slaughterhouse and as a firefighter, he joined the Allgemeine SS in 1939 and was drafted into the Waffen-SS in 1940. After serving on the Eastern Front, illness led to his transfer to Auschwitz in 1941. There, he rose through the ranks from guard duties to Blockführerrand, eventually Rapportführer, responsible for roll calls and disciplinary measures. Kaduk became notorious as one of the camp's most brutal guards. He was known to personally administer lethal phenol injections into children's hearts just moments after handing them balloons. Prisoners feared him so much that they avoided even looking in his direction. He would kill prisoners without any reason whatsoever. He used his hands or simple tools. One survivor described him as walking into a room, picking someone out, and killing them on the spot. He was also seen placing a blanket over a prisoner's face and sitting on top of them. The victim had no chance to fight back. He would also drown prisoners by forcing their heads under water until they stopped moving. Sometimes he did this in tubs or barrels. Kaduk enjoyed suffocating prisoners. One of his methods involved using a wet blanket. He placed it over the prisoner's head and pressed down so that the prisoner could not breathe. Some struggled, others passed out quickly. Death followed in silence. He used this method mostly on the sick and elderly. These killings were not part of official orders. Kaduk chose to do them. He enjoyed causing fear and pain. Survivors remembered his face, his voice, and the way he laughed during the murders. After the war, Kaduk was arrested by Soviet authorities. In 1947, a Soviet military tribunal sentenced him to 25 years of hard labor, but he was released in 1956. He then moved to West Berlin, where he worked as a nurse and was nicknamed Papa Kaduk by patients. In 1959, Kaduk was arrested again and became one of the main defendants in the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. He was convicted of 10 counts of murder and participation in the collective murder of at least 1,000 people, beatings, and abuse by kapos. The real tragedy of the Auschwitz camp was that torturers could be found among the prisoners as well. Aside from guards in SS uniforms, prisoners lived in constant fear of their fellow inmates, the kapos. These men, former criminals, also held power over life and death. Kapos were prisoner functionaries appointed by the SS to oversee forced labor and maintain order in the camp. Kapos were often selected from the ranks of criminal or political prisoners, and were granted certain privileges such as better food, clothing, and accommodations in exchange for their cooperation. And while some kapos used their positions to aid other prisoners, others were notorious for their brutality, often exceeding the cruelty of the SS guards to maintain their status and privileges. This behavior was sometimes driven by self-preservation, as failing to meet the expectations of the SS could result in punishment or even death. Most kapos used beatings to maintain order, which was, by the way, a daily reality in Auschwitz. Kapos kicked prisoners in the kidneys or the testicles. They used clubs to strike heads, backs, and legs. A simple mistake like hesitating to obey an order could trigger a brutal attack. Sometimes there was no reason at all. Violence was random and served as a control. Some kapos, however, took torture further. They would take a prisoner and break his legs with a metal bar. Then they would order him to stand and run. When the man failed, he was beaten again for disobeying. Others were forced to crawl in circles, slapped and kicked for moving too slowly. If someone cried out, more blows followed. Obviously, for some capos, the violence was not just punishment, it was entertainment. They especially enjoyed showing off in front of SS guards. They wanted to make sure they were not replaced and thus become the victim of some new capo crushed throats. Similar to the capos were the block elast or block elders. They were responsible for maintaining order within the barracks. Their duties included overseeing daily routines, roll calls, cleanliness, and discipline among the prisoners in their assigned block. They too used their power to torture prisoners in silence without orders. A recount of one of the survivors describes a block elder who had a sick routine. He would place a prisoner on the floor face up. Then he would step on the man's throat. Slowly and firmly, he applied pressure until the prisoner stopped moving. While doing this, he sat on a stool and ate his meal. Other prisoners had to watch without moving or saying a word. They knew they could be next. Another block elder used boiling soup kettles. During mealtime, when prisoners lined up for their watery soup, he picked one. He grabbed the man by the neck and forced his head into the kettle. The prisoner fought, but there was no escape. Fielder held him down until the body went limp. Then he let go and the next man stepped up for his portion. Every prisoner knew there were no rules. Even food could be deadly. The block elders and capos made sure that every corner of Auschwitz held fear. Sexual abuse. Life in Auschwitz was a combination of constant humiliation, hard labor, and heavy beatings. There were no exceptions. From children to elders, everyone was subject to inhumane treatment. But in Auschwitz, only women were exposed to yet another danger: sexual violence. SS guards in the camp held complete control over prisoners' lives, and as we're about to see, their bodies as well. They were free to single out any woman and force her into a sexual act. Sometimes it was done in exchange for food, protection, or lighter work. But these deals were not made freely. Hunger and fear made resistance impossible. Many women gave in just to survive another day. However, most were taken by force. The abuse started with a roll call in the women's camp. Guards used these occasions to select women they found attractive. Selections most usually took place in the evening. Women were taken to separate rooms or barracks and returned in silence, horrified, ashamed, and changed. Once the practice of sexual abuse expanded, Auschwitz officials organized brothel in the camp. These were officially set up for male prisoners, capos, and block elders as an incentive for good work. But the women sent there were prisoners themselves. Some volunteered to escape worse conditions. Others were forced. Once inside, they were under strict supervision. Aside from sexual abuse, they were exposed to physical maltreatment and suffered from repeated infections. Paradoxically, some SS guards formed relationships with female prisoners, especially those with privileged positions. But these were far from romantic relationships. The power imbalance was absolutely in the guards' favor. The prisoner's refusal could lead to punishment, transfer to worse labor, or even death. Unfortunately, the sexual abuse was only one part of the story. Very often, women, victims of sexual abuse, would end up pregnant. In such cases, they were left with no options. Very often, they would be killed as soon as it was discovered they were pregnant. If a woman was left to give birth to a child because of the severe conditions and maltreatment in the camp, delivery was often fatal. Mothers who gave birth were separated from their babies. Newborns were not allowed to live. However, the worst fate was experienced by pregnant women who were sent to the medical block, where doctors conducted experiments on them and their babies. These almost always ended up in severe torture and ultimately death. Medical experiments. Block 10. This and other kinds of medical experiments were conducted in Block 10, a brick building in which Nazi doctors, including Isef Mengele, Karl Klauberg, and H. Schumann, did some of the most terrible torturings on prisoners. The work of these monster doctors focused mainly on sterilization, reproductive studies, and genetics. The prisoners chosen for these experiments were mostly women, although men and children were used as subjects as well. One of the main doctors in Block 10 was Dr. Karl Klauberg, a doctor obsessed with finding a cheap and efficient method to sterilize women. He aimed to develop a procedure that could be used on millions of Jewish women to prevent them from having children. Klauberg's experiments involved injecting caustic substances into women's reproductive organs. These chemicals were intended to block the fallopian tubes and make conception impossible. The injections were extremely painful and often caused severe damage. As a result of such procedures, many women suffered from infections, internal bleeding, and unbearable pain. Many died from the procedures. Those who survived were often left infertile and plagued with long-term health issues. Another doctor working in Block 10 was Dr. H. Schumann. He also focused on sterilization, but this method involved using X-rays to target the reproductive organs of both men and women. Prisoners were exposed to high doses of radiation, which caused severe side effects, including burns, ulcers, and all sorts of infections. As Sohn might expect, none of the prisoners received proper medical care after the experiments ended. In many cases, the doctors continued the radiation procedures until the patient died. The body was then sent to the crematorium, and a new prisoner was brought in to take their place and continue the experiment. After the war, Dr. Karl Klauberg was captured by Soviet forces in 1948. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his sterilization experiments at Auschwitz, but was released 7 years later as part of a German-Soviet repatriation agreement. After returning to West Germany, he resumed his medical practice and openly spoke about his experiments to the great outrage of the German public. Dr. Horst Schumann was captured too, but by American forces. However, he was released already in 1946, after which he worked as a sports doctor. When he was exposed in 1951, Schumann went into exile. He was eventually extradited to West Germany in 1966. His trial began in 1970, but was suspended due to his health. He was released in 1972 and died in 1983. Neither of these two monstrous doctors seem to have faced true justice for the unspeakable crimes they committed. Lethal injections, Abspritzen. The atrocities carried out by the doctors of Block 10 went far beyond inhumane medical experiments. These people who had sworn to help others were directly engaged in the mass murders of prisoners. They were an integral part of the Auschwitz factory of death. While guards used gas, rifles, and beatings to kill prisoners, doctors used their medical knowledge as a method of execution. They killed prisoners by injecting substances like phenol, gasoline, eye-open, or air directly into their bodies. These injections were usually given in the chest or arm. The goal was to kill quickly and quietly. Doctors and their medical staff used this method especially on prisoners who were sick, weak, or no longer able to work. One witness described the process as Abritzen, which means injection in German. Victims were brought into a room, often the infirmary or a separate block. They were told they were getting treatment. Instead, they were injected with a fatal dose. Death came in seconds or minutes. Some victims gasped or convulsed. Others died silently. The bodies were quickly removed and taken to the crematorium. The killings were carried out by doctors and their medical staff. They did it without hesitation, as if it were part of normal duties. In some cases, injections were given one after another without stopping. Witnesses recalled seeing rows of bodies after the procedure. One man said he saw a pile of naked corpses stacked outside the injection room. The process became mechanical. There was no paperwork. The goal was to make the extermination efficient. Since many of the victims were never registered, the SS was able to cover up the killings. This way, thousands of victims disappeared without a trace. No one ever knew what happened to them. This method was used regularly. Hundreds of people were killed this way. Not even children were spared. In one case, 2 train transports arrived from the town of Zamość in Poland. The children brought were boys between 13 and 15 years old. At least 60 of them were killed in one day using phenol injections. A survivor remembered how the boys were lined up, taken in groups, and never returned. Anyone who could no longer serve the camp was a candidate for a lethal injection. They were fast, silent, and left little evidence. The method reflected the cold, systematic approach to mass murder in the camp. Joseph Mengele, Block 10, the hospital from hell, was however by far best known for the wicked experiments of Dr. Joseph Mengele. a well-educated and respected academic before the war. Dr. Mengele arrived in Auschwitz with a fascination for twins. He believed they held the key to understanding heredity, knowledge he hoped would serve the Nazi goal of expanding the Aryan race. However, his methods in Auschwitz were all but scientific. They were brutal. As soon as a transport arrived, the twins were separated from the crowd. They were given better food and medical attention, but only to keep them alive for experiments. Mengele conducted daily medical procedures on them, including frequent blood withdrawals, painful injections, and comparative surgeries. When the research stage ended, they were killed at the same time. Another group targeted for experimentation were dwarfs, hunchbacks, and people with congenital deformities. These individuals were also separated during selection and placed under special observation. Mengele wanted to discover what caused their abnormalities. Mengele's staff performed full autopsies on their bodies, including a detailed examination of bones, organs, and tissues. They removed spinal cords and preserved skeletons, which were later sent to SS institutes for study. Children and adolescents with a disease called dry gangrene of the face were also studied. It began with a reddish spot near the mouth and soon spread to destroy the cheeks and nose. The disease was common in the gypsy camp, especially among children with hereditary syphilis. Victims were used for live observation and post-mortem analysis. Treatments involving malaria injections and toxic arsenic-based drugs were tested on them. Most died in agony, and their disfigured corpses were sent to dissection. Mengele's obsession with eye color led to another line of cruelty. Prisoners had chemicals injected directly into their eyes in an attempt to make them blue. The procedures caused excruciating pain, blindness, and permanent damage. Mengele also took part in sterilization experiments much like those of Dr. Karl Kloberg, but his approach differed. He focused on preventing reproduction among groups labeled undesirable by the Nazi regime. Jews, Roma, and others, not even pregnant women, were spared. They were examined, then sent to the gas chambers only so that their corpses could be brought back to the dissection room. It was a complete disregard for human life. Inside his lab, the atmosphere was one of constant fear. Mengele could appear kind, even gentle, only moments before ordering a prisoner's death. He was unpredictable, and that made him even more terrifying. Contrary to his claims, there was no scientific merit in his work whatsoever. It was driven by racist ideology and a desire to shape the world according to Nazi fantasy. Unfortunately, Dr. Isef Mengele, or the Angel of Death as he was called, managed to evade justice for the remainder of his life. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Mengele was briefly detained by U.S. forces, but was released due to a lack of identification. He had avoided the double S blood type tattoo, a key identifier for Nazi personnel. Assuming false identities, he worked as a farmhand in Germany before fleeing to South America in 1949, aided by a network of former SS members in South America. Mengele settled in Argentina, but moved to Paraguay and later to Brazil after Adolf Eichmann was captured in 1960. He died by stroke in 1979 as a free man. Torture in Block 11. After everything we've heard about the torture methods used in Auschwitz, as hard as it is to believe, we haven't yet reached the place prisoners feared the most. This is the story of the notorious Block 11 standing cells. Block 11, also known as the Camp Jail, was located inside Auschwitz zone. Prisoners feared it more than any other place in the camp. Located near the Black Wall, it was used for torture, starvation, and execution. The worst cells were located in the basement. These were punishment cells, but the prisoners called them standing cells. They were small brick chambers, each measuring barely 90 by 90 centimeters. 4 prisoners were crammed into these narrow spaces through a small floor-level door. Once inside, they could only stand. There was no room to sit or lie down. The air was stale and limited. A small opening allowed some air, but it was not enough. Because they were held upright, prisoners could hardly sleep. They could only lean against one another to rest. If one lost consciousness, he simply collapsed against the others. There was also no room to relieve themselves. They had to do it right where they were standing. Over time, the cell floor got soaked with urine and feces, so prisoners had to stand in their own waste. With no ventilation, the stench inside was unbearable. Prisoners were confined in the standing cells overnight, after a full day of forced labor, receiving neither food nor water. After enduring hours of discomfort, they were compelled to return to work. This grueling routine persisted for days or even weeks, designed to crush them both physically and mentally. One survivor recalled that being sent to the bunker was far worse than a beating, saying, "At least a beating ended." In the bunker, however, there was no relief. Time seemed to stop. He described the sound of men moaning in the darkness, whispering prayers, or begging for water that never came, as the most horrifying experience of his life. But Block 11 was not only about the standing cells. It also contained rooms where prisoners were interrogated under torture. In some, inmates were bound to iron bars and whipped. In others, they were stripped and forced to kneel for hours on gravel, motionless, while guards inflicted additional torments at will. The worst, however, was the cell containing a specially designed torture device, the so-called Bogger swing, also called the Boer swing or bog shackle. This cruel apparatus was invented by SS officer Wilhelm Boyer. It consisted of a wooden beam supported by 2 iron trestles. Prisoners were tightly bound, with hands cuffed over their knees, and a stick threaded under their knees and over their elbows, locking them into a rigid, immobile position. The beam was then lifted, suspending the prisoner upside down, the weight of their own body pressing painfully on their joints. Once suspended, they were beaten repeatedly with sticks, clubs, or whips. The assaults could last for hours. Witnesses reported that victims screamed until losing consciousness, after which the officers would revive them with water and continue the torture. When finished, prisoners were dragged back to their cells, bloodied and broken. The beatings caused severe bruising, fractures, and internal injuries, and death was not uncommon. One former inmate testified seeing prisoners return from the bog swing with swollen faces, closed eyes, and bodies soaked in blood, appearing as though they had been attacked by wild animals. Another survivor described a man who returned unable to walk or speak, his hands paralyzed and head hanging helplessly. The bog swing was mainly used during interrogations, often to extract information or forced confessions from prisoners who sometimes had nothing to admit. Its sole purpose was to break the human spirit and inflict maximum suffering. Boer reportedly enjoyed the process, swinging the beam back and forth as the beatings continued. It was his own invention, so brutal that even some of his colleagues later claimed they had no knowledge of it. Like many SS officers, Wilhelm Boer fled Auschwitz just days before its liberation, leaving behind his barbaric device. After the war, he disappeared. Boger maintained a low profile for years until his eventual capture in 1959. 6 years later, he was brought to trial during the infamous Frankfurt Auschwitz proceedings. The key witness was Frau Braun Boger's personal secretary, who fled Germany after the war. If it weren't for this woman, the world would perhaps never have learned about the most monstrous torture device in Auschwitz. Her description of the method is chilling. A prisoner would be brought in for questioning, stripped naked and bent over the bar, wrists manacled to ankles. A guard at one side would shove him or her off across the chamber in a long, slow arc, while Boer would ask questions, at first quietly, then barking them out, and at the last bellowing. At each return, another guard, armed with a crowbar, would smash the victim across the buttocks. As the swinging went on, and the wailing victim fainted, was revived only to faint howling again. And the blows continued until only a mass of bleeding pulp hung before their eyes. Most perished from the ordeal, some sooner, some later. In the end, a sack of bones and flayed flesh and fat was swept along the shambles of that concrete floor to be dragged away. The bog swing was indeed a symbol of cruelty inside Auschwitz, a thing that prisoners feared more than death itself. As we come to the end of our terrifying tour, we've learned that Auschwitz was designed to kill, but only after it shattered the bodies, minds, and dignity of its prisoners. Torture here wasn't an exception. It was the rule, and it had only one purpose: to break the human spirit beyond repair. Today, we must learn our lesson and remember what was done in the name of ideology, obedience, and hate. Thank you for watching. And hate. Thank you for watching.